in watching the show, I remember something I really wished I had gotten to with you. Talking about the medical profession, and there are many, many people who take their business elsewhere to other kinds of medicine, alternatives to medicine, and we live in an age of so many fads and so many self-help fads and types of an herbal fascination and laying on of hands and all those things. I would love to hear you, without being able to focus my question very well, talk about alternative medicines that people are attracted to.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a very important and interesting problem, and I think that it is part and parcel of what I was talking about this mesmeric thing that went on at the end of the 18th century. You see, medicine has really only become even marginally effective in human welfare in the last 50 years or so. You could have removed doctors from the scene up to, well, anyway, 100 years ago, and really it wouldn't have made any difference to the size of the population or even to the health of the population. Perhaps the population might slightly have risen if you had removed doctors from the scene 100 years ago. And I think people in the late 18th century were very well aware of this. They knew perfectly well that most of the interventions of the medical profession were lethal. They bled you and poisoned you. And mesmerism seemed preferable because actually it was doing nothing, at least, which is one of the appeals of homeopathy, which also came in at the same time, and hydropathy. The advantages of those forms of medicine was that they, first of all, made an appeal to the whole person, rather than to the parts of the person. And they also did not involve spectacular side effects, which the interventions of the surgeon and the pharmacist involved. And I think the same sort of thing's going on today. There are demographers and medical statisticians who would say that the contribution that is made by the medical profession to the overall size and health of the population in the West is comparatively small when you consider the enormous amount of money that's spent on it, both by the clients themselves and also by the state, as compared to the enormous welfare which actually is due to things like public health, nutrition, nursing care, and health measures, just simply like not smoking and weight reducing and so forth. And you could certainly say, I mean, one of the most fascinating things that happened between the end of the 17th century and the beginning of the 20th century, you see the population start to rise. You see the birth rate falling and the death rate falling, but nevertheless the population starts to rise. Now, this does not coincide with any spectacular invention in medicine. No drugs or operations can account for this rise. So the only thing that you can say is something else happened to the population in the West, which accounted for that really quite dramatic alteration in the structure of populations, and in a quite dramatic alteration in the prospects of humankind. And it was much more to do with the improvements in nutrition, improvements in ventilation, in drainage. And you could say that in many ways that the contribution made by Romanticism was much greater than the contribution made by medicine. That the introduction of things like ventilation and nutrition and drainage arose as much from a new vision of the value of the individual person as it did from some particular interest in the scientific, interest in his constituent parts. And that, you see, it's very fascinating things like books of domestic medicine, which were introduced in the 1770s, probably had a very large effect on the prospects of the newborn child. Not because they made advice about drugs, but because they introduced new and commonsensical ideas about washing and wrapping of children and about breastfeeding of children. For example, there was a textbook of domestic medicine written in the 1770s which went into many editions right into the middle of the 19th century. And the most important contribution that book made was to advise mothers not to farm their children out to wet nurses, to breastfeed them themselves, to wash the child regularly, not to give it solid food from the first day of birth, nor wine and spirits, for the father to take an interest in the child, to speak to the child rather than to wrap it tightly and put it in a cot. And taking all those bits of advice together probably had a very large influence on the health and prospects of the newborn child, much greater than any contribution that was made by medicine as such. And I think that probably now, to return to your question, the reason why I think there's a retreat from formal medicine is partly because people are frightened by the enormous expense of it, particularly in this country, and the quite unjustified expense of medicine. Secondly, because they are aware of the fact that all sorts of unjustified intrusions go on into their own body, and there's a sort of, if you like, a national liberation movement going on. It's a sort of Viet Cong of the body. You know, it's get the invaders out. We are our owners of our own interiors. We don't want these technologically equipped Western soldiers coming in with their equipment and their drugs. Get out. We'd rather look after ourselves. And I think that the movement in favor of occult and fringe medicine is partly to do with a sort of physiological national liberation movement. A feeling of we'd like to look after our own interiors. Please keep away with your esoteric equipment because we don't know what you'll do to us with it. Defoliation will occur. And indeed, defoliation does occur. It has to be faced. Many of the drugs that are used by the formal profession are dangerous. They dismiss them as side effects. Well, they're side effects to a doctor. They're the main effect to the patient.
That's right. They're just effects. Why do they call them side effects?
Right.
Especially if the side comes to the front.
I mean, unfortunately, this often leads to throwing the baby out with the bathwater. People say, oh, well, everything to do with modern medicine is foolish. It is violent, vile, and inhumane. Therefore, let's entirely eat grass and have gold needles stuck into us and go to witches and so on and so forth. I think that this arises from a failure to understand the nature of the body. And that's one of the reasons why I did that body program. I think that people would be less frightened of doctors if they knew something about what was going on in their interior when these invaders came in with their terrible shotguns and instruments and poisons and defoliating devices and so forth. But there is a retreat from medicine for that reason. It's part and parcel of that large-scale retreat from modernism which goes on. A lot of the movement of the American radical right. I mean, there's a thing that Daniel Bell pointed out in the 50s, that a lot of the retreat from federal government and so forth, federal taxes and the paranoid view of fluoride in the water and so forth, is not so much a particular feeling that fluoride is dangerous, but a suspicion that some sort of scientific Machiavelli is inaccessibly manipulating your destiny. And therefore you retreat to a form of medicine which allows you to have control over your own physique or your own future. And I think it's part and parcel of that large-scale irrational retreat from an incomprehensible modern rationality which is administered by some sort of arcane expert operating from a concealed and hidden center. So it's all to do with that. And I think that it can be overcome in the end by simply telling people what's going on when the doctor is doing what he's doing, and familiarizing people simply with the principles of their own physique.
The last time you were here, you said something that many people interpreted as saying, if I needed an operation, I wouldn't have one. You know what I mean? You had said something about, you'd said if you got terribly bad news from the doctor, you would probably be tempted to say, oh, throw me in the dustbin.
That's right.
Rather than to go through... could you clarify that a bit?
Yes, I'll try and clarify it a little. It's not because I suspect my own profession. It's because I'm much more pessimistic about the outcome of almost anything. That on the whole, I know that if doctors got their hands on me, rather than doctors got their hands on me, that I would be the one who'd have a bad time with it.
Even though it worked for everyone else?
Even though it worked for everyone else. Their hand would slip when they got to me. There would be a mistake. I'd get the side effects, not the effects that they were seeking.